What's up? Welcome to a new episode of Movie Schmovie. This is episode number 384. My name is Steve. I'm one of the co-hosts. And just like every episode, I'm joined by...
Right.
John, babe.
John, babe.
John, babe.
There's going to be a fun episode. We have Ronald. We're finally getting around the Ronald's required viewing pick from a few weeks back, which is Black Rain. Michael Douglas, Andy Garcia. And then we're going to talk a bit... Stephen Root. Well, we'll get to that.
Yeah.
We're going to talk a little bit. I think John and I saw Mission Impossible: Dead Reckoning Part 1, so we'll talk non-spoiler, just general feelings about it. Maybe we'll talk a little more once Ronald's seen it. But we did all get to see Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer. So, you know, when this episode comes out, this is like it's what's turned into the biggest weekend of the summer, presumably and possibly, and really. Yeah. You know, the Barbenheimer marketing, the Barbie marketing, the Oppenheimer, you know, buzz, everything's kind of built to this moment. Unfortunately, we did not get to see Barbie, which I don't even think it's screened. I don't think we got anything on that, but we did see Oppenheimer this week, and we did see it in 70 millimeter, not IMAX, but we did get some 70 millimeter, which was a pretty nice presentation after a little bit of a rocky start. But
and it's a big screen, not the biggest, but it's a big screen.
Right. But we'll get to that as our bigger feature review for the episode. And then, you know, do our usual closing thoughts. If anybody has any other mentions, recommendations. But yeah, let's get into your required viewing, Ronald. Tell us a little bit more about Black Rain, why, where you at, or where were you on it when you kind of like, you know,
right.
It made
Ronald, before you get into this, is it okay if while you're doing this, if I score it by hitting on metal pipes?
Yeah.
And like electronic cymbals with a lot
like
of kind of hiss and reverb on them and stuff.
Press your finger down on the synth for like but yeah, 1989 Ridley Scott directed movie Black Rain is a story about two cops, one played by Michael Douglas, one played by Andy Garcia, who's kind of doing like an Al Pacino something. Oh, all right. We're gonna do it like this. It's very uncomfortable. It's like it's weird.
I closed my eyes for a second. I was like, did I not stop the movie?
Hey, Steve, I just surprised I brought Andy Garcia onto the Zoom tonight.
Andy Garcia sounded so crazy in this movie. So
no, you're right though. Andy Garcia, people always do that as a Al Pacino. They amp that up and it's an Al Pacino. But if you bring it down, the same impression, it's an Andy Garcia impression, and it's actually like that's more of a niche item as an impression. Maybe people should be doing Andy Garcia impressions.
Just slow it down a little bit. Maybe I just didn't notice before.
You just become 40% Cajun, and you sound like Andy Garcia.
So the story is about a crime that was committed in the States in New York by a Japanese gangster. He gets arrested by Michael Douglas's character Nick Conklin and escorted to Japan so that he could be tried to the greatest extent of the law. And then foible. It just gets crazy from there. And this is interesting. Yes, it gets really crazy.
Bloody and muddy.
It's an interesting movie because I really thought, I'm like, Blade Runner, like, what is this gonna feel like post that? And it wound up being something that had a totally different identity than I was expecting. It's a little rawer than I was expecting. I thought it was going to be a little more like just kind of glaring at each other from tables away, like the scene in Scarface before the shooting happens in the club. It's kind of two groups of people looking at each other in these beautiful shots. But it's actually a gritty ass movie, and I thought I was super curious because the cover looks like something out of Terminator, so I was super curious about it based on the poster. And what do you guys think? Because I know Steve, you're like attached to this movie. I need to know this backstory.
Well, attached. I don't know. I just know I like this movie, and I remember watching it a few times growing up, and I don't know, like. I can. It's like one of those things we've said before. Like I have like a visual of the box on the shelf, you know, at Blockbuster, or even like when I worked at Hollywood Video. I can remember seeing this box on the shelf, and like it's got like a visual, like much of Ridley's stuff. It's just like there's imagery that stick with you, and like that VHS box or the J card or whatever they called them, like that always stood with me. But yeah,
You know
I've
what this
always
movie feels like? Oh, go ahead.
no, I was just saying, but yeah, I've always remembered enjoying this movie.
I was just gonna say this movie to me feels like Ridley Scott doing a Tony Scott movie.
That's a good call. Yeah.
That is really good.
In fact, I wonder if Tony Scott drugged Ridley Scott and like showed up in his clothes on set and just pretended. No, I think this movie is interesting in a lot of little ways. Like it's like like a lot of movies of its time. Now, when you look back on it, just this many years later, 33 years later, 34 years later, it's the culture has changed around movies like this. I think that this movie sort of holds up better than I thought it would in that way. In that, like the racist characters that we meet are the white cops who we are seen to be wrong and to be like, I wouldn't say that Michael Douglas's character grows in this movie necessarily, but he does develop a personal relationship with the Japanese cop Masa, I think was
Masahiro.
And I thought that relationship was fun to see, and that actor was great because he did feel like a real kind of like working cop rather than like a kind of glamorous action hero type of thing. And Michael Douglas is so odd in this movie. Like his hair is so hilarious, like from a 2023 standpoint. And there's something I don't know what it was. He just looks. He's just got a funny look about him. Like he needed more of 5 o'clock shadow or something to. He just kind of there's something kind of soft seeming about him in the face. Not necessarily his physicality is very lean and he's moving a lot in this movie, but something about his face just seemed. I don't know. There was just I kept smiling whenever they would cut to him and it was supposed to be like an intense moment or like even him smiling. And he just seemed kind of funny. I don't know. I like Michael Douglas. I don't think he's bad in this, but I do think his face made me smile for some reason. I don't know why. And I saw that like there was talk that Kurt Russell or Harrison Ford could have done this movie. And I started to think, does that mean Harrison Ford would have had that hair? Or like, was that a wardrobe decision or was that an actor decision? Because I'm very glad we don't have visions of Harrison Ford with that hair. But I feel like
this is definitely a Michael Douglas hair. And Kurt Russell could pull this hair too.
But Kurt Russell could pull this hair, maybe a little bit lower hairline, but it would be the hair for him. But Harrison Ford, it would have ruined like whatever was happening with his mojo in 1989. He was doing, he'd just done Last Crusade at that point, so he still was pretty hot. I think it might have wrecked the rest of his career if he had showed up with his hair. But no, I think that it's an interesting thing for that reason. Like it feels like sort of minor note Ridley Scott when you think about the scope of what the story is, even though it's got like an epic globetrotting kind of story, it still is like you said, Ronald, it's a very gritty, pretty simple, lean storyline. And so part of me thinks like I don't know that they really did exploit the possibilities of like this fish out of water story of him being in Japan, but I also think that just in terms of throwing you into the visuals of a world where I mean from the American standpoint you don't know the language, and the movie doesn't hand as much to the character as these movies usually do give to like the American cop coming over. They're kind of not given that much respect when they show up, so it's a little bit of a different kind of down in the gutter perspective on this sort of storyline than you might normally get. And I wonder if that was the hook. You know what I mean? I wonder if the grittiness was sort of the hook in 1989 when someone like Ridley Scott was drawn to this sort of pedestrian material. Like it's not like that elevated, I guess is what I'm trying to say. But I think that there's a lot about this movie that elevates it in some way.
It really ducked out all the tropes. Like I thought they were going to have the nasty food scene. He's fucking every piece of food up that he can find in every, it's like very, it's not what you'd expect. Cause another version of this movie would have been like, oh, I've never had this before. Sushi. I don't need anything raw. It's just like that kind of thing.
Take this back and cook it. Like that kind of line.
Yes. None of that happened. And that was pretty cool. It was nice that the issue was solely his inability to speak the language. I really like that. And he was shitty about it. And his demanding every time that he moved around, and I better have somebody that could speak clear English. I love that, man. It's such an asshole American thing to do that just felt right. And he pulled it off, man.
Yeah.
I couldn't help but think watching this. So I watched this after I saw Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1.
Okay.
And like you're talking about like the look of Kurt Russell in this, and the entire time I'm watching,
Mike Douglas.
I'm sorry, Mike Douglas. Well, all I could think about was like, I don't know about age-wise, like if it works, But any sequence that Shea Wiggum was in Mission Impossible,
Oh my
I was
God.
like, you could put that guy right now in Black Rain, and
Really?
it would probably be like so much better. And like, I'm
Shea
all
Wiggum would be killing. I mean, honestly, I'm on a
Right?
high with him after that
Right?
movie.
Yes.
And I've always loved him, but like,
Yeah, yeah, we're all fans. Like anytime he pops up, you're like, you're in for something special. But like having just seen that like 2 days before I watched this again, and even it's funny you mentioning like just the hair and like the
Yeah.
look, and even like some profile shots of Michael Douglas and Shay, like they have more of like kind of like a pointed nose, like just the way that they looked and the way that he acts in Mission Impossible. I was like, he would be so good in this thing where he takes this guy to Japan and just is like so out of place.
I mean, honestly, Steve, it's the slight thing that I didn't notice. Even if you look at the poster, that iconic poster you're talking about, Ronald.
Yeah.
Michael Douglas looks a little bit like a Hollywood guy trying to look like a guy who fights.
Yes.
And in the movie, he has a funny physicality. When he goes in for a fight, he does this little like, I mean, I believe it, but it doesn't, there's a nebbishy quality almost to Michael Douglas that I never really think much about. He's an everyman. He really works well as an everyman or as a dark version of an everyman.
Yeah.
But Shea Wiggum really seems like he might clock you.
Yes,
in almost any role, he's got some kind of seething, barely coiled rage that's inside him. And I really do think, Steve, I mean, not that we need to improve. That's not what we do with this segment. But what you're describing is the quality that the lack of whatever it is that Shea Wiggum has that Michael Douglas doesn't.
Right.
That is what made this character amusing to me in this movie in a way that I do think sometimes was intentional. But here's the thing. I think in 1989, if they were intentionally saying this guy is a little bit nebbishy, Michael Douglas would have had like slick back hair and little glasses. They would have made him obviously that. So I do think he's supposed to be more of just like, he's the standard guy, cool American, corrupt cop, as we find out.
Yes.
And I like that the movie ends on a slight like thumbs up to being a corrupt cop, possibly. Like I don't know. How do you read that ending when he leaves his very ethical Japanese kind of partner, de facto partner? He leaves him with the counterfeiter's plates.
Yeah.
And what he says to him before he leaves them with him is he implies either, you could turn these in, you know what to do if you found them, or you know what to do if you find him. You know what I mean? Like he's saying one thing or the other. A guy could do pretty well for himself if he had a hold of those plates, is what he says, something like that. And then he gives the silliest like thumbs up as this like,
but also not looking at him. He's kind of like, he's in
like
the
MySpace.
He's in a MySpace post with his thumb up. Kind of look. It's so weird.
But I mean, it's like a Mentos commercial, kind of like two people across a crowd seeing each other. But I mean, like, how did you take that? Do you think Masa is going to turn those in and like use that to like rise up in the ranks because he did something good, or do you think it's like it's going to be something he keeps in the back of a drawer and he's going to break them out one day and become, be able to pay off a few, maybe it like updates to the house, maybe
I think Nick corrupted him.
But we're happy about it.
He brought that American way.
But it's like we're all smiling about that at the end. We're all glad to see. Well, I'm glad this American cop could tutor this Japanese cop in how to be corrupt.
This is how you do it.
I love when he told this story about the corrupt thing that he did about taking the money. And the guy was like, you shamed your boss. He's like, oh, okay, cool. He's like, no, but you've also shamed me. Yourself. And then you've shamed me. And then he said his family.
Yeah.
He said everybody. He said everybody that he shamed. That felt so excessive, but I loved it. I loved how guilt. He was like laying the guilt on. And Michael Douglas just had to sit there and eat. Well, Nick's character had to sit in there and eat all that information. How many layers of shame that he's created.
But he didn't seem that bothered.
No.
He was
No.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes as you see a movie like this and you want to laugh at things that you realize might have been part of the fun of the movie that was intended.
Yeah,
that a lot of the stuff we're saying, this sounds like something that screenwriters in 1989 would have been aware of about a character. Michael Douglas is no dummy. Ridley Scott isn't either. So maybe it was part of their point to not quite do a Big Trouble in Little China thing of having like, here's a hero who's really kind of a dumbass. It's not that, but it is like the joke's on him a little bit. Like if there is a joke, if there is a cross-cultural joke, he's the butt of it, not the guy laughing in this movie necessarily. So But it is also dated and has some of those great, like that score with like certain moments. Isn't this a Hans Zimmer score? If so, it might be the first time Hans Zimmer worked
yeah.
with Ridley Scott, and they would do a lot of stuff together, so no, fun choice.
Good stuff.
Yeah. So Steve, you're the next pick.
Yeah, I feel like these like crime thrillers kind of got me thinking about maybe some ones that fell through the cracks for me. And again, talking about like those covers I remember seeing. There was always one that I never watched. I always meant to watch it. I actually think I even owned it at one point. But this is 1992's Deep Cover, which is Lawrence Fishburne and Jeff Goldblum, directed by Bill Duke, who most people probably know from Predator or Commando as an actor. He was Mac in Predator and Cook in Commando. But yeah, I don't know. Like I've always heard good things about the movie, especially like just Lawrence Fishburne at that time in his career. Kind of getting more into some like leading roles. And obviously Jeff Goldblum at that time is interesting, or is always interesting.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's always been one that has gotten, it's got a great reputation, and it's been recommended multiple times to me. But I've never seen it. But yeah, going from 89 to 92, sticking in this kind of crime thriller look. And so yeah, Deep Cover, and I checked, and it's available. If you have HBO Max, it's available on HBO Max for streaming. And I think it's like $2 on Amazon if you want to rent it. But yeah, Deep Cover would be my next pick.
Can I throw on a factoid about Deep Cover?
I would prefer it if you did, yes.
The song Deep Cover is performed by Dr. Dre and Snoop Dogg.
There you go.
That is the first recorded song that Snoop ever put out.
Wow.
Yeah.
Crazy. Awesome.
Crazy. Really good song.
A lot of firsts. First Hans Zimmer score for a Ridley Scott movie, and next week we're going to be doing the Snoop Dogg debut. I have a running list of movies that I want to watch for some reason or another that I consider to be my required viewing list, and I usually hold off on watching them to watch them with you guys. And many times when I make a choice, it's something new jumps in and beats the list. Yeah. But I'm looking at my list. I think I might have to find what is the crime thrillerist thing to be my next choice. It might not be from the same clutch of years that we've been dealing with, but I do have a couple that look like good choices. But I like this. I like the little pocket of a certain kind of movie. But also this movie is like so 1989 that that's another thing I love about required viewing is when we jump into an era of movie making and you can totally feel like that moment. And like maybe at least that you can see why this seemed like cool material to do, because it does feel like it was the kind of imagery that was, really commercial during this time. But
yeah.
All right, cool. So Deep Cover.
That's an exciting one. I haven't seen that in a really long time. So I appreciate you saying it, man.
Thanks, man. You know who likes to go into deep cover is Ethan Hunt. I don't know if you guys have heard about this cat.
Look at you. Transition.
So yes, we're sort of in the bag for the Mission Impossible movies. We don't have to go back too far to, well, I guess the last movie was maybe when last time we really talked about it in detail, but I feel like whenever these movies come up, we sort of generally nod to, we've been excited about this one. It's sort of pre-sold on it. So, I mean, I think I went into it with the question being much more of like, how is this going to be different? What's this going to be compared to the kind of run they're on in this series, like the last couple? This is the third one in a row directed by Christopher McQuarrie. Is that correct?
That's right.
Yeah. So it went from being kind of a director's, playground franchise where you have De Palma and then you have Wu and then you have Abrams and Brad Bird. It's like, and now it's like the McQuarrie Cruise franchise, at least, for this movie and the next one. So it's like, it's a slightly different beast now. And I don't know, it made me think a lot about franchises and franchises that go through phases and, franchises that last this long with a central actor. And that's kind of what our conversation has been about it. But Steve, I feel like if you didn't lead off on a Tom Cruise movie, that would be a sort of a crime against humanity. So maybe you can talk a little bit about this movie and how it fits in with what Mission Impossible has become, and also maybe just what the series means to you.
I mean, honestly, like I think it's one of the strongest series out right now, and it's one of the rare exceptions where I feel like it's kind of gotten stronger as it's gone along. And yeah, you're right. Like when McQuarrie, or when Christopher McQuarrie and Tom Cruise started working together, They've done a number of things together. They did like, I don't even know how far back it goes, but like Valkyrie and what was the other one they did? Jack Reacher. Like they have a great working relationship, it seems, and they're very much in sync. And it seems like Tom Cruise is kind of in that phase of his career where he's kind of working with, he went through that phase where he was working with all of like the like basically the greatest filmmakers ever made or that ever existed. You know what I mean? Like he had his, he had his bullet list of like everybody that you could think of, and he's been in a movie by them. And then he kind of got into this phase where he's more so way more involved like with the production and like, very much more hands-on and kind of this idea of like getting people into movie theaters, especially post-pandemic, during pandemic times. So, I mean, it's really an interesting thing to look at Mission Impossible, because it's been 5 years since Fallout because of the pandemic. And to see that, even with that time, the movie is performing well enough, and I think it'll have legs and continue to go on to be a very successful movie. But yeah, the thing that stands out for me really is that performance in terms of it does feel like the franchise is getting stronger as it goes along. And I don't think that's a very common thing, and it's very unique. I'd say the only other recently one is like people could maybe argue that John Wick is kind of in that same ballpark. But it is also a testament to like, Tom Cruise's star power. We have conversations all the time about like who are movie stars anymore. And especially on a global, in the global scheme of things, like he is probably one of three left. Right. Depending who you want to, how badly you want to argue for some other candidates, but he's a no-brainer. That said, yeah, this was one of my top 3 movies of the year in terms of anticipation. Like we said on the last podcast, I think we mentioned it last week, like we didn't get to see the press screening for it because of technical difficulties. So I did go see it in a Dolby screen still. And yeah, I mean, honestly, I was in the bag. Like John said, I love this movie. I need to see it again to really feel like where it ranks, like, in the franchise for me, because a part of like that first viewing experience was really kind of just like, I was kind of really just kind of knocked out a little bit in terms of like, how many action set pieces there are. And for a movie that is 2 hours and 40 minutes, 45 minutes, I kind of felt like it moved at a really fast clip. Like it was moving very quickly for me. So like, just to be able to take it all in was I want to do that again. Big takeaways for me, like on the plus side, I love the idea of Tom Cruise aging with this franchise, even though he's 61 and still does these crazy stunts. I think in the scope of what Ethan Hunt is to the franchise, this movie does a great job of like kind of showing him falling behind in some sequences, or being outwitted or outsmarted or out physically, like he's not a perfect spy anymore. He doesn't win everything anymore. And he's got like flaws, like he's got like these weaknesses at times. And I think that's cool just to kind of see where other people, exceed him. And that's the great part of the team he puts together. I think that really kind of gelled really well in this movie. And like that reliance on each other really kind of comes to the forefront. The whole idea of like the MacGuffin of the film, or the villain, quote unquote, of him. I'm not sure that I really love all of the AI stuff going on in the movie. It's interesting, and it's now, and it's topical. And maybe that'll be a little more well-rounded, or kind of come into view better in part 2. And I have a feeling it might, from what some feelings I have about how it's framed in this one. But yeah, man, I mean, I don't know. Like you said, I'm in the bag. Like I was smiling the whole time. I was impressed, getting some goosebumps here and there, getting emotional a couple times in the movie. It's just, I just love these movies so much. And yes, I love Tom Cruise, but it's like they could be mutually exclusive. Like I love Tom Cruise and I love the Mission Impossible movies. So like he is these movies, yes, but there's so many other great things in these movies. The cast that they built around him: Rebecca Ferguson, Ving Rhames, Simon Pegg, Haley Atwell is incredible in it. Pom Klementieff is amazing in it. We mentioned earlier Shea Wiggum. Like there's a lot of great new characters on the screen that I think they give a lot of time to, which surprised me in some sequences. Like a lot of Haley Atwell and a lot of Pom's character, more than I thought. which I think is great for the series and the setup for whatever's to come in part two.
Yeah.
But this is a definite recommend for me. And again, I'm not going to go into any spoilers. Maybe we'll talk more when Ronald's seen it. But where did you fall in it, John? Like, what did you think of it?
I mean, I guess I can just kind of pick up a couple of things you said. One is, I think an interesting thing about this movie, and something they're going to have to deal with. You're right that they're dealing with it. They're going to have to deal with it even more, though, as screens get larger and resolution gets better. They are going to have to deal with 61, 65, whatever it's going to be, year-old Tom Cruise. He's going to have to stop buying his hair. They're going to have to stop pretending that women melt at the sight of him or something. You know, there's just going to have to be something they do to adjust to that. This movie had a couple of moments that were kind of... I mean, it doesn't hurt the movie, though, because it's Tom Cruise. But like when he does like the sleight of hand stuff with the key, and it's like, I think that's supposed to be cool, but it actually feels very much like a guy in real life would feel if he started doing sleight of hand stuff to a woman, you know? But it's like the movie moves through it so quickly. You go, you know what? Tom Cruise is still playing this guy that we agree is cool. And it's kind of what you said. Ethan Hunt can be kind of a dork. And it doesn't hurt it's not like James Bond being kind of a dork would hurt James Bond terminally. Ethan Hunt can be kind of a dork, and it can even be the Tom Cruise persona that allows us to enjoy that, because we do know that he's like not, I don't know, he is what he seems to be, but he's also this other sort of weirdly sincere, weirdly all about it guy that is just like in our ironic times. I don't know that people quite know what to do with a guy like that, you know. So I think there is something interesting about these movies that, as you said, that like they know what they're doing with, like, this is a franchise that exists outside of Tom Cruise, but he is the movie in so many ways. So him being like the emotional spoke around which the other characters rotate makes sense. And I think that they might be able to successfully, I mean, maybe he'll quit before he dies doing a stunt, but I could see them successfully shifting him into a slightly less focused center role at one of these stories. You know, I mean, I don't know that they need to do that, but I'm just saying I can see them doing that, the ensemble they're building. So I think it is an interesting new movie. I think Fallout for me is still my favorite one. Like when I think of the sequences in that, the fights in that, the villains in that, I think that's the one that's the most recent one, right? That one's got the best, craziest action in it. Nothing in this quite tops that. However, there is a train sequence that is, the way it escalates, it's just insane. And I will say that maybe that was the moment when I was moving in my seat the most and going like, oh shit, this is like, you know, because that's where the payoff of they do as many real stunts in these movies as they can. And then of course there's the motorcycle jump that everyone's seen from the trailer. The movie builds up to that in a very almost funny way of like making you wait for it. But when you see it coming, you're, no pun intended, you see it from a mile away. I mean, but you're sitting there going like, oh man, he's going to have to jump off a fucking mountain on a motorcycle, isn't he? And the way the movie plays with what you think you know about that stuff, I don't know. I just think it's very interesting, kind of to all the things you said about the type of franchise this is. It's about the sequences. It's about the stunts. It's got people, other characters we really care a lot about. I do think this movie's early scenes are kind of hurt by I attributed it to like a COVID filmmaking thing where like maybe actors weren't always in the same room together, but there's scenes with like Luther and Benji talking where the angles, there's like weird close-ups that break the you know, what is it, the rule of like, I forget what, the crosses the line, where it's like the eye lines don't quite match up and you can't tell what's going on. And there's one scene with a bunch of bureaucrats talking where it's a group of people briefing Kittredge, the main sort of bureaucrat in this movie. And the people briefing him, they all trade off saying like sentences. It's as if they've all memorized the same script and they're all trading off their sentences. And it's just like, oh, every actor in this scene gets a chance to say something. But it'd be like, this weapon is one of the greatest weapons anyone's ever created. And another one says, it could kill 1,000 people in 2 seconds. And then the other one says, and you wouldn't even know it. You know, it's like, and it feels a little bit like it was a little too much of that. However, I think that once this movie establishes its rhythms and gets into that meat of the story, and it might be like you said it, Steve, when Haley Atwell's character kind of enters and becomes part of the thing, I feel like it really took off. And I'm not saying all that's because of her. I'm just saying because at that point, the plot has been firmly established, and it's all that AI stuff. It's like the MacGuffin of the movie. In my opinion, it took like 15 or 20 minutes to set that up. That could have been maybe 5 minutes But I don't want to always. We talked about this after Oppenheimer. I'm sick of. I might just not say it ever again. I'm sick of always saying movies could be shorter. We all know. We all know the moment. That most movies should be like an hour and 40 minutes. We all know that.
Yeah.
So let's just say, like, for the last time, movies could be shorter. This movie could have been shorter, but to your point, Steve, it doesn't drag as it goes on. It's amping up, and if you were thinking this is starting off a little slow, by the time it kicks off, you're not like I wasn't like looking back on that bumpy opening stretch, but I did feel like the first 3 or 4 scenes were like not quite connected enough for there to be real momentum, and I was beginning to think, oh, is this movie a little stop and start? And then once it started, I was like, oh, okay, I'm not too worried about it.
Yeah, it does feel like it picks up momentum as the movie goes, and I do think that train sequence at the end. Something I noticed is like, there's a lot of action sequences that definitely feel like, somebody might criticize them as like, they're retreading like scenes that have already been done in prior mission films, or at least similar to the prior ones. Like, there's like that there's like a sandstorm scene and the train scene, and like a car chase. All these things have happened in other films, yes. But I do feel like they've found ways to like kind of escalate them in some ways, especially with the train sequence, because you're right. At like the last like 3 minutes of that train sequence, like I was not comfortable in my seat as well. Yeah. Like it was very, very awesomely made. Like just you have as you feel like your main characters are gonna probably be fine, but just like going through the sequences, the situation that they were in, and like you said, the practicality of how they shoot it is just like, it just makes it so much more tangible. And like seeing them bounce off of seats and like climb up on top of a train, like that stuff just is so much better. And I hate to say it, like comparing it to like Dial of Destiny, the train sequence in that, it's just like, I think that's where you really see the difference between these shots when they're like practical and not. And they do so much of this stuff for real in the mission films that it just makes it even more impressive, I think. And then, the train sequence is awesome. But I really, really, I think Fallout's probably still up there for me as kind of the peak. But this is it's on par. Like it's in the conversation. Like it's as entertaining as any other mission film.
Okay, you know what this felt like to me, Steve, and this is not a knock necessarily. This is just to add clarity to it, to Ronald, because we've talked about the Fast and the Furious movies, how they had kind of, and even though those aren't my jam, I know that around the 4th one, they hit a new gear, and then the 5th one really exploded into that world, and then people like the 5th, 6th, 7th one a lot, and then after that, the 8th one, I don't like that one as much. Well, the 9th one could be better. The 10th one, did we just see the 10th one? We did, right?
Yeah.
That's a part 1 of 2, whatever. Like I feel like this movie, this was the first time that this series felt like, okay, it's still got that class that you expect from the Mission Impossible movies, but it was dipping a little bit into that. I can see a Fast and the Furious effect, because especially with the villain being this kind of high concept thing.
Yeah.
But this whole idea of, well, there's one man who can do it, and it's like, how in Fast and the Furious, it's always a little silly to believe that the government, like espionage experts, would be like, these former car thieves are the people that we need to parachute in some muscle cars. But like, you buy it, if you are into those movies, you buy it for the fun of it. Like that's just, it's silly, but we get past it. Mission Impossible, James Bond, I feel like it's not, we're not quite going into like Roger Moore Bond territory, but we are getting into a little bit more of, you just have to believe that the Impossible Mission Force is this, like, they literally go rogue every time. You know what I mean? It's like, even in the movie, people talk about it, how it's like, this guy has gone rogue his last 10 missions or whatever. So it is a little bit of a joke, and it's a little bit silly, but I was thinking how, what if this franchise had a couple, 3 movies in a row that were a little bit huge and amped up and a little bit sillier? It's like, would I mind if they still have visceral action sequences like the ones you're talking about? And I don't think I would particularly. I think it would lose a little bit if it lost that kind of, that patina of class, but I don't think, again, I don't think leaning into Tom Cruise aging hurts the character that much.
Yeah.
Also in this movie, it's, speaking of Fast and the Furious, they do a great job of making the sort of family vibe like important. His whole thing that's in the trailer where he says, that your lives always matter more to me than my own. Like
Great line.
It's a great line, and you super feel it. And it's the thing that keeps me coming back to these movies on a certain level, is knowing that at some point they're going to break my heart with one of these characters that helps him, and that's something a lot of these types of movies don't have. Is that, I mean, Fast and the Furious has that sense of a family of characters, but once everybody dies and comes back, it's like, well, okay. It doesn't have the same, it doesn't hit the same as in this series. You would believe someone would die and it would mean something. It wouldn't be like, setting up for another one. So I don't know. I think this, the health of the franchise is strong. Even if I don't think this is the best Mission Impossible movie, it's like, that is actually a very high bar. Honestly, the way I feel about Fallout is that it was one of the best theater movie going experiences I've ever had. So
holy moly, guacamole. Now I got to see it in the theater, man.
Well, I was not saying that about this one. I was saying that about Fallout. I'm saying this one's pretty damn good. But
Fallout's the last one.
Yeah, that's where, I mean,
oh my
that's
God.
the Henry. That's the Henry Cavill.
Henry Cavill cocking his arms.
Yeah.
Scott, like, I feel like that in and of itself can't be beat by any other movie.
There's only one scene that really compares to it. It's like this it's like Jackie Chan movie, and it's him and this like clay-faced dude, and he's like fighting him. It's like a 10-minute fight scene that's relentless. He beats him, and then Jackie kind of realizes that he has to fight in his own style. He was trying to fight his style.
Yeah.
And it had a similar sort of feel to it. That movie was special, man. That's why I'm excited about this one.
Yeah.
Henry Cavill, like you said, you mentioned this offline, but maybe he'll come back to the franchise. I would love to see him come back. He's like, I didn't die. I was hanging out.
He's so super dead, but him coming back with like cybernetic parts, you never know. Like after you have AI as the villain, there's a lot of stuff you could do.
I'm so curious about what you mean by that, but I don't want you to give it away. Is it?
No, just go see it. Yeah, we'll talk more.
Okay.
I mean, you do have Isai Morales as like a heavy. You do have a human villain. It's not that. It's not super. But it
it's
is
not like a
Steve
floating
said,
head. It's like
but as Steve said, it does go a little bit beyond. I don't know. It's kind of what I'm saying. It's like a little bit of a heightening of the world, a little bit of a not quite comic booking of it, but a little bit more close, inching towards like sci-fi or something.
Yeah.
But Tom Cruise invented that genre, so he can do it if he wants.
Did brick by brick though. Brick by brick. Cool. So you guys suggest seeing it? Okay, that's pretty.
So
cool.
Steve, what do you think about calling it Part 1? Do you think they should have just called it Dead Reckoning? Because this doesn't feel like an incomplete movie. I want to say that it doesn't feel like Fast and the Furious. It doesn't feel like Across the Spider-Verse. It ends with a mission still to pursue that branches off, but this movie makes a complete loop of a story. It's not like one of those recent movies that really is like half of a story. I didn't think. I mean, for reasons I don't want to spoil, I can't explain what I mean by that, but I didn't feel like this movie left me going, what happens in the next 5 minutes? What happens in the next 10 minutes? It feels like we're at a resting place, not in the middle of a moment. It's more like the end of Empire Strikes Back or something like that.
Okay.
Cool.
Like, it's definitely, I mean, I guess I see why it's got the Part 1 again without spoiling anything in terms of how the movie ends. So no, I think it works for the movie. I do agree though that it's like, this is a complete movie. Unlike Fast and the Furious, or even some people have felt that way about Spider-Verse, but I wasn't one of those, by the way. I think
the disdainful way that you said that.
I think the title's fine. I think the way it ends, it does end this story, but we're halfway there, I guess, without spoiling something. But yeah.
So do you think we really get the next one next year? Do you think there's any chance of that?
Yeah. No. I mean, I heard somewhere, I forget, I think it was Haley Atwell, maybe someone said that they've only shot like 40% of it.
Yeah.
Boy.
If that's accurate, and I don't know if that was as of, how long ago, but I mean, a lot was shot. It's a lot of stuff they shot for Part 2 while Part 1 was shooting. But I mean, Part 1 was so like riddled with COVID stuff that like there was like 9 different rap sessions. Like if she was on the Happy Sad Confused podcast, and she was basically like, she rapped like 8 or 9 times on Part 1. like because they had to break it out so much because of COVID and shutdowns and moving,
and now everything's shut down too.
Right, moving continents and shit like that. Like it's just so I don't know where that leaves part 2, but yeah, there's both Spider-Verse and Mission. I don't see any way we're getting those movies next year, but that'd be nice if we did. But take your time, make them awesome, because both of them deserve like an amazing final one. So yeah, let's move on to Oppenheimer, to the big one of the big two this week, the one half of Barbenheimer.
That is wild, man.
Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer, which has been talked about a lot. There's been a lot of it's. I was trying to think of something last night when we talked after seeing it, and I was just like, it's kind of crazy to think about Tenet's release, and very openly, like, people know about like how unhappy he was about like the way Universal handled that release, and he moved over or Warner Brothers, how Warner Brothers handled it, and he moved over to Universal for his next film, which was then announced to be Oppenheimer, and now it's kind of culminated into this weekend, because he loves this like second and third weekend in July. It's like one of that's like his date for his movies, and it's crazy that like they're going against each other, and it's like rival studios and his former home, but it's just
also
wild.
Two properties that couldn't be more like not opposed, but like just the picture of Barbie next, just the optics of it, the imagery it makes for a nice contrast. It's an interesting example of how the movies are kind of back in a way, or it never quite ended, but like you could see Barbie or you can see Oppenheimer this weekend. I think that's where the memes began, was just that it felt like everyone wanted to go see both of these movies, and they seem on the face of it like they couldn't be more different, so it's an interesting,
but it's just weekend. Like the idea of like two big blockbusters coming out the same weekend.
Right. Well, that's what I mean. But and they're that different, and it's like counter programming. You couldn't have planned it better if you were looking at counter programming.
Yeah.
But just and just like the history of it, it's just kind of wild to think about. That the next thing post all that drama around Tenet and theatrical and protecting the all that stuff, and now it's like your next one
is going to
it's not gonna, it was never gonna win a head-to-head with Barbie. It was never projected to either. Like John said, these are different offerings, but they could serve they both can serve the same person and many people. Like there's enough to each of them that would I can't wait to see Barbie, and I couldn't wait to see Oppenheimer. Like all three of us were interested in both, but it's just that story piece of it for Nolan, because Nolan is like one, and I said it to Ronald after we left the movie last night, was like, he may be the director brand, like that really the movie is really most of what people are talking about or seeing. Like he's one of those directors of again, I don't know, maybe a handful.
Who else? Maybe Jordan Peele, maybe
Tarantino. But I mean, the thing with those, well, especially with Tarantino, is that his movies always have like, and don't get me wrong, Nolan has stars in his movies, but like the movie aren't the stars for him. I don't think, the movies, the scope of the movies of Tarantino films and Nolan films, like they're in the same conversation. But I feel like some of Tarantino's films, like their performances or the actors or how big the actors are in those lead roles, I guess go hand in hand with Tarantino, where like with Nolan, at least in this one, and honestly, even in Tenet, like the leads in these movies aren't stars. They're not box office draws.
I mean, I want to go there with you, but I do think that the stars are on display in the trailer. Even if you don't think Cillian Murphy is a big name, you still see Matt Damon in the trailer for Oppenheimer. You know what I mean? Sure. And Matthew McConaughey. So it was in Interplanetary. So I guess I'm Interstellar. A friend of mine made a low budget sci-fi movie called Interplanetary that I always get screwed up in my head with Interstellar. Couldn't be less on the money spectrum. It couldn't be further away from that movie. But I think you're right, but I also think that part of it reminds me of Paul Thomas Anderson, maybe, who might not always have a big star at the center of one of his movies either, but just from who's in the movie, you get the idea that anyone will work with this guy, and I think that Nolan has that quality of like, he could get anybody to be in these movies. And I think the part of the fun of Tarantino, it's almost the Coen brothers thing of like, oh, look who showed up to have fun in the Tarantino world. You know, that's a little different from the Nolan world, where it's not like who showed up to have fun, but there is a lot of fun, if you want to call it that, in a movie like Oppenheimer, like looking at who pops up in a small role, the character actors that he uses. It's not quite Soderbergh pulling in like comics and you know, funny people to fill in the weird roles, but it is like a good bit of adroit casting that really, like, even if it's not a big character, seeing someone in the background of a few scenes, like I think James Urbaniak is in one scene in this movie, and he doesn't say anything, but he brings something to it, and him being in it adds to it, you know. So there is something to what you're saying about the sort of quirky ensembles in a way that that exist in a Nolan film, but I still feel like anybody would answer that call, you know.
Yeah, I think Paul Thomas Anderson's probably like a better comp from what I'm describing. But if you compare the two of them, it's like they're in different conversations because Nolan is a box office draw.
Right.
You know, PTA's like movies don't make big box office, or most of them don't have big box office receipts. You know, Tarantino does. I'd also argue that, like, you know, if you look at the posters for the movies, you know, with the exception of maybe Batman, you know, the star of the movie, you know, is on the poster, or no actors are on the poster at all. It's just like Christopher Nolan is across the top of this poster. And I think that's a big draw for a lot of people. You know, Tarantino's a good one. You know, even like the name means a lot, but I'm specifically speaking to the box office draw.
No, I know what you're saying. Like, Spielberg used to maybe mean something like that. Like, it used to be like the new Spielberg movie. Maybe even Tim Burton, like if we want to look back to his run of successes. I get what you're going for. Yeah. There's more.
Yeah, Jordan Peele is in the conversation for sure. Like, he's got a brand as a director.
Right. But it's a mainstream appeal that we're talking about. No,
that's what I'm referring to.
No. Good. You're right. That is like a, not necessarily a more rarefied air, but it is a different group, because we're talking about, I mean, we are talking about good movies, but we're also talking about that get people to come in. So we're talking about
right. And he also stakes out a prime weekend in the middle of summer blockbuster season. You know, like that's a flex too, as a
right.
But yeah, I don't know. But yeah, Ronald, why don't you kick it off? Because, you know, we were talking about Mission a bit ago. Why don't you start us off for Oppenheimer?
Why don't you drop in the Heimer? The hammer
Sure.
on Oppenheimer. I'm
Drop
sorry.
in the Heimer.
Yeah.
That sounded weird.
It did.
It made me uncomfortable.
Dropping hammer on Oppenheimer.
So Oppenheimer, Chris Nolan's escape from Warner Brothers. What a big movie. I mean, it had a lot riding on it. You know, this feels a little more like it. What I didn't realize until I kind of set foot in the theater and sat down and started watching it is this is his Godfather. This is his, you know,
Citizen Kane.
Citizen Kane is first, you know, De Palma's
JFK.
Yeah, De Palma was Scarface to me. But
gotcha.
There's something about, I mean, and Batman too, obviously, but those are kind of different. Those are like IP sort of things versus a historical thing. He's taken on this.
It's his first like official, like true story. I mean, Dunkirk was based on facts, but this is his first that's like, you know, an attempt to take a historical figure and explore them.
Yeah. And it's the most out there I've seen him, to be completely honest with you. I kind of watched the companion documentary that came out on Peacock, To End All War, Oppenheimer and the Atomic Bomb. He's in it.
Yeah.
I haven't seen him.
I saw that. Yeah.
He's like outside. He's like promoting it. He's really showing his face, which is really cool. So, you know, this feels like a fight that's a little different than it was before. It feels like he kind of took, you know, I kind of talked about this before. You know, when like Danny McBride had like 2 or 3 different things before this, and then he combined those elements to make this thing. So, you know, pacing wise, I don't think that this thing is perfect by any means, but in terms of scope covered in this thing, I mean, he covers the little guy, the big guy, the in between, the implications of what it would do to you mentally. You know, this dichotomy of who he kind of turned himself into, which they kind of downplayed a little bit. the Oppie sort of personality that he had was a lot more of a switch than it was presented in the movie. Apparently, he was nothing like that before, like on any level. He was kind of a person that people really despised, and then he was just like, I'm gonna travel and become Oppie, this cool Oppie J. Also was another name that he had. Go ahead, go. You were saying, Steve.
No, I was gonna say that's a great observation, because there's even a line in the movie where like I forget who it was. It might have been one of it might have been the Safdie brother that's in the movie, makes the comment that like he's like no longer primarily a scientist, he's now a politician.
Yeah.
Like that characterization of himself, it
Right.
is a switch in the movie that you can feel, like you're saying, really.
Yeah. So it's cool to see the scope that they covered. I mean, you know, even if it's like not as in depth as like a book maybe, or like a doc that specifically focuses on these things, but man, I'll talk about the things that I liked first, and then I'll let you guys round robin it. But yeah, it's not well paced the first like 20 minutes or so, but once it finds its ground and starts moving, it really picks up. It really is. You feel the effects of the arms race. You feel this urgency that may have been kind of exaggerated within the circles that he was in. The relationships that he had, the conflict that he had, that would inevitably be his unraveling, you know, at some point. Just being responsible for that many people dying is a heavy idea, and creating a weapon of mass destruction, but using your skill of science to reel you in. Like, how can you make something that exceeds the science of another group? That, you know, it's so manipulative, but it's such a cool thing to watch a man kind of be like, I gotta outdo these people. I gotta outdo the murder. So, you know, it's a really, Nolan could have skipped over that in like in a pro-America sort of thing. And he really takes these stances that are so anti whatever that propaganda is in some ways, but very showing you what it means, to kind of buy into those ideas, that is so cool and subtle and just, it's genius. And I was telling, this is the last thing, I was telling Steve, it was crazy that I was able to follow all of this stuff and really get what was happening. And sometimes it feels like movies are purposefully trying to lose you in that way.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. I mean, Nolan in particular, sometimes like there's a puzzle aspect to his movies that you don't really know until you get to the end what he was doing at the beginning.
Yes.
And that might be irrelevant to the type of movie that it is, and sometimes like with a movie like The Prestige, that's like the part of the point of the movie is to like do that to you. And it seems like he likes, like, even Dunkirk, which didn't seem to need trickery, there's storytelling trickery in it, but I still feel like you get something out of it. When you get to the end, you can say why he did that, or why telling the story that way was a valid approach. I mean, not that it always is, you know what I'm saying though. Like, I think that's what you said to me when we were walking out last night, was that like this was a case where you felt like you understood the way that he was fractalizing the story more while it was happening, or you understood the purpose of it more while it was happening, even if this is the movie that seems like it would need it the least. But I feel like we're getting into someone's mind, and we're talking about like reality smashing and splitting the idea, splitting atoms, but splitting ideas too, splitting scenes, splitting. I mean, there is something very appropriate about the way this movie isn't tethered in time, even if sometimes, you might say, well, why is this story that would be compelling if told straight? Why is it being told as kind of a puzzle?
Yeah.
Well, I guess I'll throw in Ron. You know, I'll do the same thing. I'll talk about the stuff I liked or loved, and then we can get into, you know, whatever other thoughts we might have. I do think when we were walking out, the word I used, I said I was bored. I think the word, I was on the way home, I thought about it. It's like, I think exhausted was the word more that I would have used. Is that the movie, I was having a little bit more of a problem than you were, Ronald, like finding my footing in those fractal scenes, like especially the first chunk. I felt like I was watching kind of a bad biopic, like the scenes of him meeting a new character and then them saying something to him, and then it cuts and he meets another character. It felt like a clunky kind of biopic, however beautifully acted and really interestingly edited and well shot. And I was like, okay, I'm this dialogue being kind of basic wasn't really hurting my engagement in the movie. And I did feel like there were some moments that kind of rushed past, like, oh, we got to introduce this character, we got to introduce that character. And I don't know that we needed all the stuff that they introduced. Like, I really don't know if the personal relationships that they show with Florence Pugh and with Emily Blunt's character, I don't know that I felt that stuff, the necessity of that stuff. I think the actresses are good, and I think Christopher Nolan he catches shit for being bad with female characters or just not giving them much to do. And this movie felt like, I mean, there were some moments towards the end where I feel like Emily Blunt's character, her actions and her words would have had more weight with me if I had any idea how he really felt about her. But I had no concept. I didn't get any sense of how Robert Oppenheimer felt about his wife. You know, it felt like he was holding her at arm's length the whole movie. But outside of those kind of issues, as I was going through it, what I found was not that it ramped up and then it got better as it went along, but that when it got to the end, I thought back to that beginning, and I was able to see more. Oh, I see now more what they were doing with at least the way it was fractalized, at least like why we were seeing this version of him, and there's like 3 different levels of the story. And I started to understand a little bit more like why maybe we were seeing it, and even why it was filmed the way it was. We have some stuff in black and white, and then I think we have some black and white stuff that's in a different aspect ratio. And then there's like 2 or 3 different periods. It reminds you of something like Dunkirk, where you're watching interlocking stories that are taking place over different periods of time. But instead of simultaneous stories like in Dunkirk, we're seeing like, and you're right, Ronald, you have to catch up. You have to keep up with the narrative in this movie. But what I thought this movie did brilliantly was hit you with that exact stuff that it needed to hit you with, which is just the moral choices of this man, and how maybe you might call it a moral failing or a submission to his own ego that had horrific consequences for the future of the world. I mean, there's no way to talk about this subject and make it sound as big as it is. The choices that were made by the scientists and the people that were using the scientists in this period of history are choices that could keep you up at night today if you really think about not just the world we're in, where there's so many different ways to destroy us all, but the idea that people had these choices in front of them and they made the choices that they did, and that it became part of this American myth of saving lives by doing this horrendous thing, and how we did it. Everyone else does horrible things, but America does horrible things for the right reasons, you know. And this movie really, like you said, Ronald, it's not un-American, but it chips away at the lie that Americans sleep on. And I don't mean sleep on like aren't aware of. I mean sleep on like you tell yourself this lie so that you can sleep at night, you know. This movie really feels bold and shocking and upsetting in that way. And I do think Oppenheimer is a character you can hang all that on and not have it feel like too much. I think the stuff that's kind of funny about Christopher Nolan is you feel like he identifies with Oppenheimer on some weird level. But I think that's true of all the great like narcissistic filmmakers. Their ego is part of what makes their movies big and great. And so him believing that maybe he sees a little of himself in Oppenheimer is both him pumping himself up and him tearing himself down. But I think if you didn't have that kind of relating to the character, you couldn't do as intimate and weird as this movie is. I think that you couldn't do this movie the way that it's done if you didn't find something in Oppie that speaks to you. And we should say Cillian Murphy is insanely great in this role. Like his eyes communicate so much. You somehow see that he sees what's happening even when he's in denial about it. And I think that's like not every actor can play that kind of ambiguity. Well, hit us with it. Why don't you drop in the Heimer? Steve,
stop trying to make drop in the Heimer happen.
Now I'm gonna get t-shirts printed.
No, I mean, I don't know. I coming out of the theater, I felt like, you know, I was definitely the highest of the 3 of us. Like I definitely, I was kind of blown away by it, to be honest with you. Like I feel like the score, and just, you know, it's consistent for Nolan, and you know, this is a Hoyte is the cinematographer for this one. Who also did, speaking of Jordan Peele before, did Nope.
Okay, yeah, I can see that.
But yeah, it's just a beautiful. I mean, this is like one of the reasons you make that pitch of seeing movies in theaters. Like this is the one you see on a big screen, a loud theater. You know, this is the experience kind of movie for sure, no question. But yeah, I honestly was kind of just blown away by the scope of it. The performances are incredible. I love this idea of, you know, black and white and color and subjective and objective narratives, which is kind of what he's commented on in a lot of recent interviews. That that's the intention of the black and white versus color,
right?
Like following Downey's character and following Cillian Murphy as Oppenheimer. But yeah, I don't know. Like, I think the scope of all the performances, all the different actors that kind of come to play, even if it's for a scene, some that are promoted, and some were very nice surprises that I won't mention on this discussion, just so people can go out and maybe be as surprised as we were. I know for one of them, I like looked at John and I was like, I had no clue he was in this movie, and we were both like, yeah, me either. This is amazing. And
it's a great scene.
And right. Yeah, it's a wonderful scene. But yeah, I don't know. Honestly, I got to say something, and I felt the exact same way about Dunkirk, and not so much about Tenet. Tenet was for me, but I feel like Dunkirk is kind of the same feeling I had walking out of Oppenheimer, where like I was in the bag to see this movie. The scope looked amazing. The story looked really interesting. I really do love Christopher Nolan films in general, and as a filmmaker. Mm-hmm. But I did not expect to like it as much as I did. And I felt that way about Dunkirk to the point that like it was like my top 5 movies that year. And I have no doubt that this is one of the best movies that I feel like I've seen this year in a theater. And I was blown away by the performances. A lot of the times in the movies, like when the score is kind of swelling, and you mentioned it last night, John, like you see these like flashes of visuals, like crackling and like dust and particles and like lights, like ribbons of light kind of swirling around him as he's like, having this fracture.
But also like a character who maybe has visions of some world within the world that looks like that. So it's like, you don't know if you're seeing you don't know quite what you're seeing in those moments, but it feels, it brings you in for sure.
But yeah, I don't know. Like I just, that feeling I had leaving the theater was something that is very rare, which is just like, I went in with expectations and, I feel like they were exceeded for one, but like, it's just a feeling of like, wow, like I like that so much more than I thought I would. And I usually have a pretty good read on movies, and I don't know why it would be like now 2 of the last 3 Nolan films I've felt that way about, because I do really like his films. Like they're always some of my favorites, but I don't know.
Well, before the movie, we were talking about like 3 hours, and it felt like maybe it was going to be a little dry. And honestly, if it had been a standard biopic type movie and it had been 3 hours, it would have been a drag. But this is not a standard biopic. Like this does not, and even with like the last half hour, not even having to do with necessarily what you think the thrust of the movie is going to be. Yeah. I feel like that was a real risk, but some of the most emotional payoffs come in those smaller moments between the characters. And I was going to say some of my favorite scenes are between Robert Downey Jr. and Alden Ehrenreich, which is not something I would have expected to say about this movie, and it's like, until you see it, you won't know what that's all about. But
I just the way that those scenes build on one another, like the whole Trinity sequence and the testing sequence and what you come to the movie to see, really all that stuff is incredible.
That scene is amazing.
I think what pushes it over for me in this feeling that I'm describing is like really where that movie, like where it kicks in those last 30 minutes of the bouncing back and forth of like the hearings and the Downey character and Oppenheimer's, like I just think that stuff works so well, and the tension and the suspense is just so. Honestly, it feels like it's building to like a moment of just explosion, like not to be funny about it, but it really does feel when you're going back and forth and seeing scenes that we've seen 2 times earlier in the movie, but for a 3rd time from a different perspective, like. It's just a really creative, and maybe it's what Nolan has kind of become known for with this.
It is exactly what he does. Yeah.
He's got that like moment towards that 3rd act where it's like, I don't know if you say it's a twist or it's a little bit of a twist.
It's a reveal.
It's a reveal. Great. Yeah, that's the better way to say it. But yeah, I don't know. Like you're right though. I will acknowledge that the beginning of the movie does drag a little bit. I don't know that I felt like it was like I wasn't lost or like out of it at that point, but it did take a little bit to kind of get going. I feel like once Matt Damon's character comes in, the movie just really kicks into gear and doesn't stop. And all the way to like just a photo finish with the last sequence of the movie and just a close up and push on his face. It's just an incredible last 30 minutes. I mean, just
Matt Damon's scenes with Cillian Murphy are like, I mean, their energy, you wouldn't even picture those guys having the kind of chemistry that they have, but somehow Matt Damon manages to bring he manages to do that thing that, like, frankly, an actor like Robert Downey Jr. can do in a movie like this, which is inject a kind of humor that it needs. And I think that this movie actually had several. I mean, he's not known for his chuckles, Christopher Nolan, but this movie had some pretty solid, like, character-based bits of dialogue. And I also thought, watching it with not a huge crowd, but watching it with a decent crowd, I was like, oh, this movie's got a couple of gotcha moments, or damn, or whatever, where you hear someone in the crowd go like, ooh, or whatever. I don't know. I was like, okay, I don't always expect that from a Christopher Nolan movie, or I don't always think of him injecting that kind of humanity into his movies. And I feel like this movie does have a kind of messy humanity. And you mentioned JFK a minute ago. I kept thinking about There Will Be Blood because of the way it's a peculiarly American story about a type of man whose choices have affected us all. Except a more literal version of that. And also just the epic scope of the way that it's filmed. I feel like some of the scenes of the building the bomb reminded me of the scenes of, like, digging oil wells and stuff like that in that movie. For sure. And then the JFK thing of, like, going into history and digging in and, like, doing a little bit of a whodunit with history, as far as, like, what's the real story here. And I think that if anything hurts that stuff from a cinematic standpoint, it's the fact that we keep coming back to the same crappy little room that the hearing's happening in. But I think by the end of the movie, that was an asset. I think it was in the middle of the movie that I was like, oh man, we keep coming back to this goddamn room. But I think by the time it gets to the end and you realize, I don't know, just the different layers of what we've been seeing, I think it comes together really, really beautifully at the end.
And I think that's all intentional too. Like, I love you say reveal. Like, I feel like between the two characters, like, one wants to be on a stage and one wants to push the other into a corner. And like, I just love that, like, when it kind of comes together with those two kind of character perspectives towards the end. But yeah, man, I thought it was great. It is like, 3 hours is, man, this is a experience for sure. But you had asked me, like, when we were walking out around, like, do you think you'll watch it again? I mean, I honestly do. And I
do too.
I've watched Dunkirk multiple times. I mean, like, I just, the movie really is just like, it really hit me kind of hard last night. And I was, like, talking to Erin about it a lot more than she probably cared to hear, because, like, she doesn't really know a whole lot about it. And I'm just like, okay, well, like, we need to go see this again while it's still in theaters before it leaves. It'll be
our poor wives.
A while. Yeah, I know. She's like, oh yeah, that one. Yeah. Okay, cool. She's like, yeah, that's the one. Yeah, Emily Blunt's in that. I was like, yeah, that one.
But Nikki will say, how was the movie? And I'm like, oh
yeah. Should I just say good and move on?
Right. Would I like it is what she means. Have you seen that? Right. It's a little short video this guy made where it's like him laying in bed and he's, like, sitting there looking kind of bored, and then it says, me when I remember I have a wife to annoy, and a guy jumps up and he, like, runs through the house to go find his wife. But no, I've found myself thinking, I mean, honestly, I feel like my last 24 hours has been colored by thinking about this movie too. So I think that's, I mean, again, I think that Christopher Nolan fans are going to go into it and say, yes, this guy makes masterworks. I think people who maybe are checked out on him a little bit might find a little bit more to this one. This one feels a little bit more, you said, you were talking about it, Ronald, the great films. I mean, this feels a little bit like it's a portrait of a huge person, that those types of movies can age really well. Like Citizen Kane, I wasn't joking when I said that. Like, people still talk about so much about the choices made in that movie because of how, and There Will Be Blood too, like that kind of central character that feels like it says something about our world. Those movies live on.
He did a trick, man. He did a trick. I thought this would be the least accessible movie that he's done, and it wound up being the most accessible in a weird,
really human. Yeah.
It's like the pacing, like, once it gets into it, like, there's some shots that I'm thinking of that are gonna, I always say this, like, in the reel, you watch the reel for the, 10 years from now, they're like, cinema is made one director at a time with they show the, they're going to be like 3 shots from this movie that are going to be in it. And that's just, there's going to be way more than that. But there's 3 I could think of that are just in the top of my mind, just of, like, how things feel and how things look. And I don't think I realized just I've heard about Oppenheimer, like who he runs into, who he's interacted with, who he's in the same circle as.
Like what part of history he's really part of.
Yes,
Yeah.
and when you figure out like the dynamic with some of them, made me oddly emotional.
Oh yeah.
I think you think about. I mean, it's one of the things I can't escape is where do I fit into this story as a black man, as a black American, and honestly, I don't fit into a lot of this. I don't fit into the narrative. I don't the rules that were made up excluded me, and still do in a lot of ways. And so when I see things like this that are celebratory in some ways, kind of a pat on the back for some version of whatever it is that happened, I get a little weirded out. I didn't, but I don't know how this happened. Even with that said, I didn't feel like I still knew I was watching something really special.
Well, see, I didn't feel like this movie was celebratory at all. I feel like this movie was
no, I
was
just
very,
mean like
very
it existing
critical.
It existing is celebratory. That's what I mean. The fact that it exists in the world, and there's like no stories about other like non-black people besides like Malcolm X. I mean, non-white people besides like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, and there's some people in between that did cool. Where's the you know, there's other stories to be told. That's all I'm saying. And I just mean celebratory as in it exists in the world for people to see.
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I guess the only thing I would say is that this movie is so critical. I feel like
it's super critical.
I feel like the fact that this movie is sort of, if you want to call it like a movie about white culture, I feel like it's an extremely extremely damning portrait of the sort of culture that would make this choice.
Yeah, that's what
that's made in this movie. You know what I mean? And it's like it almost seems like it's reckoning with exactly what it is you're saying, which is like, look at the people in this room making this decision, like, and look at what it did to our world and how much people. Now, the patting on the back that happens in like that's happened in like documentaries for decades. This movie almost like takes that pat on the back.
Yeah, I mean the fact that he even has a stance like that means that it's a more, again, this is the accessible thing I was talking about for me, more accessible to me, because it's still like it's creating questions, and that's all I want. You know, I don't want everybody to be like, you know, I'm sorry that this happened. You know, I'm sorry that this happened. I'm sorry that you weren't in this history, but just Christopher Nolan being like, this is a conflict. This is a real thing. Millions of people were killed, you know, there were, you know, and then gradually through chemical things, when they talk about that, so just dying from an explosion feels like that's not that bad. But then you hear the stories
that would be the best part of it, would be being vaporized.
Yeah, just being vaporized. But then you hear these stories about people that were fine for a day or two and then passed away a week later. Like, you really need to put that in perspective when you talk about celebrating war, celebrating these moments. And, you know, as a global traveler, when you go to Asia, you realize that like it has left this like permanent black eye on the image of America. And, you know,
especially because there's so much celebrating. I mean, there's so much patting of themselves on the back for it. Here's a question 100%. I was wondering. Honestly, I wanted to ask you guys this. I'm glad you got into this topic, Ronald, because this is kind of related. Do you think Oppenheimer believed sincerely? I mean, I know we can never know this. This is totally subjective. Sure. Do you think he believed? Do you think a person could believe that this really would be the weapon to end weapons, or do you think, on some level, he knew that was a lot? You know what I'm saying? Do you think for your ego to put you in the position where you're playing with the things he's playing with, you have to have divorced yourself from the real implications? Or do you think he was honestly like naively hopeful about what he was doing?
A weapon to end all weapons.
Because that's what they talk about in the movie. Like that's the reasoning he uses, is like he believes that like this, what he's doing has a good to it, you know, and not that he's just sort of, his ego's, I want to prove that I can do this thing, and I don't, and what happens after is what happens after, you know, and as opposed to no one should ever figure out how to do this thing, you know. I don't know. Like how, like maybe I'm asking you, like, what's your judgment on Oppenheimer, the man, as presented in this movie, you know, his moral
think there's a shift. I think there's a shift in the movie. And they even like talk about that in his hearing. Like, when did you develop that moral? I forget the language they use, but like, there's a term they keep, you know, pinning him with that he uses. But yeah, I don't know. I think there's a shift in the movie. I think some of it happens when they're having the AEC meetings about the hydrogen bomb, and Heller's really pushing that. And I think that's a moment that he kind of references, even like when he makes that comment about like realizing that we don't intend to use every weapon that we would make. Like I think like that stuff is really kind of I feel like speaks to a point at which he changes. He changes his outlook on theory and execution, and like realizing theory and putting it into the real world. Just because you can doesn't maybe mean that you should.
It's the Jurassic Park principle.
Yeah. Like when you come to the understanding that if you do, it's going to be used,
right,
and you can't control that. The moment that he sees them driving off with them in those trucks, there's no visibility, there's no accountability. Like the military, I'll keep you posted best I can, is what Matt Damon's character says. Best I can.
That's crazy. That's crazy to picture. You did a science project, and then the military drives off with it, and they're going to go do what they do with it. Yeah.
And that's a moment in the movie that I feel like is like the chip in this idealist, idyllic approach that he has to theory and putting it into play. And I think it's one of the moments in that we see in the film that breaks that down. And, as it goes on, it falls apart. And I think that's kind of where he makes that comment in the hearing.
Yeah.
What do you think, Ronald? Do you think any person, making that decision, like, can anyone honestly be like, well, I had my reasons?
So I watched the doc, and then it has, so apparently Oppenheimer was really careful about the type of interviews that he did for a really long time. They'd only be like, they'd ask him a brief question that was kind of on the borderline of pressing him a little bit, and he'd answer in this eloquent way. But there's this one interview where he's a little older, where he's basically, every time they ask him about the bomb, he starts crying. He's like so broken by it. He's tortured by it in a way. He has like big bags under his eyes. You can tell he still doesn't get any sleep over it. And he calls it the bomb to end all bombs and stuff like that. Like he calls it that, but while saying that, he's also like fucking almost crying. I think there's a weird privilege that comes with somebody that could be able to make that sort of decision.
Make that shift.
Yeah,
right.
Make that shift. Like, you're gonna kill a bunch of people, and he's like, well, for science, let's multiply it as little a thing as we can. We're gonna make that's like,
what he says in the movie is, I don't know that anyone should have this weapon. I just know that the Nazis shouldn't, or something like that. So it is what you were saying, Ronald, before about the race. To be like, it becomes about the competitiveness to prove that you can do it. And it's hard not to imagine that there's some ego involved in a choice like that. But yeah, you're right. Like it is like a convenient thing to be able to do, look back a few years later and feel bad about something, as opposed to having been one of the thousands of people directly affected by it,
He can picture the science of it. He knows what that looks like. He knows the implications. He knew all that stuff, and he still did it. And the fact that he had that shift is, I guess it's nice, but he is the catalyst for killing all these people. And sure, another scientist may have made another bomb, but the blood wouldn't have been on his hands. You know what I mean? Like it's a wild thing. Like, if somebody gave me infinite resources, would I make the perfect propaganda movie that would make people turn on this play? You forget that sometimes, like, it's those little things that create the big bombs, that create terrorists, that create, and it's just it's a wild idea, and he tackles it in a cool way. So, like, even after my complaints about not feeling myself being there, this is one of those movies. This is one of those movies that, when my kid is like, hey, I heard about this movie called Oppenheimer that came out that talks about this. I'm like, I was in the movie theater with my good friends, and I watched it. It's like, I remember watching this movie, this greatest movie of the 2020. It's like,
I really do think that it will morph into that. I really do think it's gonna have an impact like that, because I'm yeah, I mean, I already feel that way right now. Like I feel like this might this might be my movie of the year so far. I don't
cool.
because of how much it kind of surprised me, how much I liked it. But and I am anxious to rewatch it too. So I mean that speaks very highly of it. But yep, I mean it's in theaters now. It sounds like a pretty good recommend from Movie Schmovie.
Yeah.
Go check it out. Find the biggest screen you can for it. Go see it. Go see Barbie. Go see anything you want to see in theaters. Just go to the theater this weekend.
Yeah,
there's plenty of opportunities. And you know what? I want to say there's a movie.
There's plenty of
opportunities. There's as well, John. Jesus Christ. We didn't get to see it. We've never talked about it, but I want to put a placeholder. There's a movie coming out this weekend called Cobweb. That's from Lionsgate. It's a horror film. Lizzie Kaplan is in it, and somebody else I should know, and I am forgetting who it is, but little to no promotion or anything in the middle of Barbenheimer. They're putting this out there. But maybe we can check it out and talk about it on the podcast in the coming weeks. But plenty of opportunities.
I wonder if Cobweb was like, can we get Cobweb into the Barbenheimer portmanteau? Right. They were like, could we be could be Barbwebenheimer? Come on, is there not room for Cobweb?
It's Anthony Starr. Anthony Starr, Homelander is the
okay. Awesome.
Wow.
But it's supposed to be really good. And
am I going to be able to take him in any other role, or is it just going to feel
dropping
like
it in theaters? I don't know. We'll see. To check it out.
Yeah.
I don't really have anything else to mention, and I'm not going to lie. I think my technology is about to die on me as we record.
No, that's
this.
A show.
I think that's a good show. Again, Mission Impossible: Dead Reckoning Part 1's in theaters. It's a recommend from us or from John and I. I'm sure Ron will chime in once he sees it. And Oppenheimer is the big one this weekend, along with Barbie. We did see Oppenheimer, so we can say this is a go ahead from Movie Schmovie as well. And just to circle back, my pick for required viewing next week is Deep Cover, 1992, and it's on HBO Max if you haven't. Moviesmovie.com is the website. You can listen to episodes there, subscribe, link right to your podcast of choice or platform of choice, or head over to youtube.com/moviesmovie podcast if you want the video option of the podcast. Every Friday, the weekend right after an episode, Ron will post those videos up there. And that's it really. We'll be back next week with a new episode. And as always, you made our day. Thanks.
Bye.
Babe.